Hello. It's the 15th of January 2016, and this is episode 39 of the Unseen Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Carr, and the Unseen Podcast is a spin-off of the WOW Signal. This is the unscripted, largely disorganized, open participation, Creative Commons, unedited version in which we introduce a panel. The panel addresses a particular topic or set of topics. We let the conversation go wherever it wants to go. Tonight, I have with us a very distinguished international panel. I'm the only American on this one. We have Adam Smith. Say hello, Adam.
Hi. Hi, Paul. Hey, everyone. Pleasure to be back.
Yes. Now you all know Adam pretty well. And also David Grigg from Australia.
Hi. Hi from down under.
And for the first time on the panel, though we've had him on the show before as a special guest, is Ryan MacDonald.
Hello there from Cambridge.
Yes. Glad to have you on, Ryan, as a first-time panelist. Now, as you all know, that Ryan was on our by far most popular episode so far, in which he and two other Mars One candidates represented their position. That has swamped the other episodes in terms of downloads. So, well done, Ryan. And tonight, though, we're not going to talk about Mars too much. Well, who knows? The conversation may get us to Mars at some point, but tonight we thought we'd talk about the moon. It's the closest celestial body to the Earth that is at least the closest in a stable orbit. And, so let's talk a little about the case for going to the moon or the case against it. What can we get there? What can we hope to accomplish by having humans on the moon? Who wants to start off?
So, why go back to the moon? I think it's important to note, firstly, that NASA is the only space agency among the nations of the Earth to have successfully sent astronauts to the moon. The former Soviet Union sent a number of landers and rovers. Most recently, China sent their Chang'e 3 lander and the U-2 rover. And they have just today announced new plans to send a rover to the lunar far side. So I don't know whether, because of the Apollo missions, there's something of a been there, done that attitude in America. What would you say that's true, Paul?
Yeah, I would. I do think we have the sense that, well, not so much been there, done that, but been there, didn't get that done.
Yeah.
It's mixed feelings. I mean, yeah, it was a flags and footprints mission. It was all about the Cold War. It was all about beating the Russians to the moon. I was only 11 years old when Neil Armstrong stepped out off that ladder. But every one of us, found it incredibly inspiring and exciting in 1969. The fact that it didn't continue was largely due to public apathy. After a few of those, you've seen it, you've done it. But we all wanted Wernher von Braun's vision to come to fruition of cities on the moon and and then Gerard K. O'Neill came along, mines on the moon. None of that happened. Largely due to American politics. Richard Nixon was the president, and he had his problems, which were had nothing to do with the moon, and when Jimmy Carter took over, he had other problems, and the space shuttle was built. We all thought the space shuttle was going to be the answer. The space shuttle did not fulfill its promise. It didn't significantly cut costs to getting to orbit. So that was the problem. The Saturn V was a marvel of engineering, but it was far too expensive to use for routine flights to and from the moon. We needed something better, cheaper, that could be turned around much more often, and the shuttle was sold that way, but it wasn't that. So my generation kind of feels cheated. We feel like we should be on the moon now, but doing a lot more than just running around and picking up a few rocks and taking a few pictures. It should be so routine that the public is bored of it. And also cheap enough that the public doesn't care.
I think it's important to understand that despite the many missions to the moon, we've only explored perhaps less than 5% of the entire surface of the moon, and no one has yet put a lander or a person or a rover on the far side of the moon. That entire hemisphere remains unexplored. I mean, we have very good orbital imagery from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, has taken the highest resolution images. So
right.
we have very good maps, but we've yet to explore that side of the moon up close. And that's where the game is now.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many images now that no one person can really know the moon to that. I mean, that's Pamela Gay's, one of her initiatives is, sort of mapping out features on the moon, because there's so many. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been such a success in bringing and sending back, and not just LRO, but lots of other missions as well, sending back detailed pictures of the moon, that we have more data than we know what to do with. But you're right. Getting on the surface is very different. You get down there. The Chinese have been down there recently on the surface with their little rover.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Chang'e 3 mission, interestingly enough, even though it was just landing on the near side of the moon, it landed on a much more recent surface than many of the Apollo missions actually landed. So even with just their very first mission to actually touch down properly, they just in the past year or so started publishing scientific results from that, and they're already starting to come up with some potential reformulations based upon that, with our current theories on the magma ocean theory of how the moon cooled down. So I mean, there's such a fantastic science case. So the popular perception that we've already figured everything out about the moon seems to be far from the true case.
Well, can you give us an example of what kind of thing might change?
Well, so at the moment, so there's obviously the main theory about how the moon actually formed from the giant impactor hypothesis with Theia colliding with the Earth. But one of the key conclusions would be actually trying to identify samples from the moon that actually directly came from Theia itself, in order to try and figure out what region of the solar system Theia came from, and also potentially trying to constrain the history of impact collisions with the moon, because it seems that the moon seemed to have been cooling down a lot slower, for instance, than we would have expected if there was a sharp cutoff between the late heavy bombardment, which seemed to end quite abruptly. So it's possible maybe that there might have been a second late heavy bombardment of slightly less magnitude. I mean, it's fascinating. It's such early days, but ultimately we are going to need to get more samples directly back from these other regions of the moon to test that.
Yeah, I mean, the far side of the moon has remained largely unchanged for the past 3.84 billion years. The only way to nail the dates, that we need to go to the South Polar Aitken Basin, which is the largest and most ancient impact crater in the entire solar system, we need to get samples from there to try and determine the age of that impact basin, and then we need to compare those rocks to younger impact basins to try and nail down the time, from the start of the late heavy bombardment to when it ended.
And
Which
there's
also,
actually, oh, sorry.
Go on, I was just going to say
I was just going to say that.
Coincides. Go on, Ryan.
So you mentioned the South Polar Aitken Basin, and actually there's a lot of interest now in missions going there. So the Russians have been interested in going back there for some time, and now it looks like they're going to be pushing ahead with Luna 27, which the European Space Agency is looking to officially confirm their joint participation with in a meeting towards the end of this year. There's also, interesting enough, not just space agency initiatives, there's also the public-private partnership Lunar Mission 1, which is interested in landing around that region as well. So we'll get our science results from there eventually, I'm confident.
NASA also identified the Aitken Basin as a highest priority for lunar science in their last decadal survey. But unfortunately, they ditched the idea of going back to the moon in favor of an asteroid redirect mission, which I think is a mistake, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Aitken Basin has more to offer than just science, right? I mean, there could be actually a fair bit of water still just under the surface or even on the surface.
Yeah.
And the Aitken Basin, which is crucial to forming a colony.
The Americans seem more intent on pushing for commercial exploitation of lunar resources, whereas the other space agencies are more intent on going for the science. And another big plus about the lunar far side would be to set up a radio telescope. That entire side of the moon is a radio quiet zone. It's
right.
Free from...
I mean, if you can solve the dust problem, you could build amazing telescopes on the lunar far side. Now it would face the sun sometimes, but that would, a lot of people have been talking about that for decades. But we have to get to where we can do that. David, you had something to say.
I was going to say I wrote a science fiction story based on that very idea in about 1970 something or other, which was the idea of an old astronomer being stranded there in a colony on the back of the moon, which was there with radio telescopes, and he's the first person to get in contact with intelligence around other solar systems. But anyway, that's just my little blurb. But if I have the chance to say something, I'm old enough. I'm probably the oldest here. I'm old enough to remember that there really were plans that Apollo wasn't going to be the end of our exploration of the moon. That there would be further expeditions, more and more detailed, more and more people actually landing on the moon and developing its resources. We've heard Adam was talking about how the other space agencies seem not to be interested so much in the commercial aspects of the moon. But surely the reason they're doing it is all to do with patriotism and national pride and all that sort of thing. Shouldn't we actually be looking at the commercial advantages of landing on the moon? Because otherwise the public are going to get bored again.
I think so. And yet ultimately, the public will get bored of anything, right? You have to bring home the bacon, and that is going to be boring. But if you can do it, if you can find a way, then it will be self-sustaining. If you can't, well, the high cost of going there is going to eventually run out of steam. I mean, I know here I don't know how it is with ESA or other space agencies, but here in the U.S., there's 435 Congress people, and they have to, all the spending bills have to come out from them, and they are not that interested in science. They are much more interested in how can I sell this to get so that I get reelected, right? That's what they care about. And
Surely there's a case for doing both.
yeah, so you have to. The problem is that if it's about getting reelected, it's about spending money in their districts, and that becomes a very expensive proposition. And ultimately, it's not paying back. So if you get the private companies involved, they no longer care about that. What they care about is, can I bring these materials off the moon, or whatever they're doing on the moon, whatever the business case is, can I do that at a profit in the long run? And if they can do that, and now there's American companies now, and I think there may be Asian companies and European companies as well, that have enormous volumes of cash that they don't know what to do with. For example, Apple Computer. Now, Apple's not a space company, but they have more money that they don't know what to do with than any government in the world. Right? They don't have to send armies anywhere. They don't have to pay entitlements. They just have this cash. And so I think it's the Googles and the Apples and the Intels and probably some Chinese companies who I can't pronounce, and that could lead the way. And
there is, of course, the Google Lunar X Prize.
Yes. Well, that's what, $10 million? I mean,
it's not a lot of money, really.
Yeah. It's really just kind of a minor incentive but the people that going for the Lunar X Prize are doing it because they really want to, because they care deeply. And then the $10 million will pay off some of the credit cards when they're done. But it's
Yeah, I think
Google could fund a manned lunar mission. I should say a human lunar mission out of petty cash, and they could start it next week. But of course, they would be concerned about all the implications for that, right? So could lots of other companies. Company, and what is Google? If you look at the transformation, I remember as in my youth, the biggest companies were car companies and oil companies. Now they're computer companies and companies like Google, what do they sell? I'm not sure what Google sells. They sell advertising, I suppose. They sell access to data. They sell server space. And Apple is, I think, the richest American company, and they sell electronics. And music.
Possibly cars.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're talking about getting into cars. That would be going full circle, really, because the biggest American companies used to be car companies, but now Ford and GM are kind of down in the middle of the table, and looking at relegation, I think. But what I agree with David. To make it permanent and to get things like a big radio telescope on the far side will take that big radio telescope, which could be kilometers in diameter, right? Tens of kilometers in diameter, which could see things that no other radio telescope's ever seen before, or even optical telescopes that are absolutely enormous, or infrared telescopes. Those could be, the science we get from that would be fantastic, but the way to get there is to make the whole lunar enterprise very, very large cash producing thing. And then the telescope becomes, a status symbol.
So there was a symposium conducted in Europe quite recently, just within the past month or so, that was actually looking at the various different models that you could pursue in order to obtain this kind of, what the new Director General of the European Space Agency has coined his Moon Village plan. And so they identified three possibilities. The first one would just be a single nation state going it alone, and they identified that China would be the most likely to pursue that model. There would be smaller aerospace companies doing things along the lines of the Google Lunar X Prize. But what they seem to particularly be interested in is a very large international collaboration doing it. So, I mean, so we talked about the kind of nationalistic trends and how the public loses interest. But it seems to be somewhat different in the European Space Agency, which is very much decoupled from the politics of the European Union and elected parliaments and such. Because it takes so long in order to actually pass a mission through the European Space Agency bureaucracy that once you've actually finally approved it, even if one member state just tries to pull the funding, because there's so many member states, the mission can usually still go ahead anyway. So it means that European Space Agency missions are generally quite stable, and hence they're much more focused on the science, which is always good to see. And so I like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the Lunar Lander mission going to go ahead in 2018? There is an ESA Lunar Lander mission that was planned for went to launch in 2018, but I'm not sure if it's going to go ahead.
Yeah, 2020 is the earliest one that I'm aware of, and that will be the one that they're collaborating with the Russian Space Agency on.
The Russians, yeah. And I think the ESA are providing a drill.
Yeah, that's correct.
Is it a big heavy-duty drill? They're going to dig down and take core samples.
Yeah, they're going to go about 2 meters down. And I mean, the Russians
that's not that.
The Russians make no secret. I mean, this mission that they want to send to the South Polar Basin is to look for resources with the long-term objectives of assessing the potential for human habitation. So that's the end game that they're playing here. And what I really like about what Europe does is that they can look to the west and look to the east, and they just collaborate with everyone pretty much.
Yeah,
so,
I'm skeptical of the Russian plans. They have economic issues with the collapse in oil prices, and
the
Chinese are a lot more aggressive.
Amount of national.
Sorry, go ahead, Adam.
The Chinese certainly have them, but the Russians have a large amount of national pride invested in such a mission, and I think Putin's fairly determined to get this mission off the ground.
But if you look at what they've done lately, nothing's been terribly ambitious. So
no, but then neither has NASA's manned space flight. I mean, you know.
Well, but I mean, man, but at least we have tremendous amount of unmanned exploration missions going everywhere, and ESA has done some good stuff in that direction as well.
Oh yeah.
And so have the Japanese, in a small way, are doing excellent things in little niches. The Chinese are very aggressive. India is coming into the picture.
Yeah, India have their own plan to do a new mission.
And the United Arab Emirates.
Well, that's probably, I think you need more than just cash. You need a national infrastructure that can support this kind of thing, like as India. You're saying something about India, Ryan?
Yeah, so India, I mean, they've already sent obviously an orbiter to the moon, but they're looking to send a lander and then a rover and a second orbiter that will go to the moon. The latest that I heard for that is they're projecting next year for that, but I don't have a more up-to-date figure.
Yeah,
don't forget that they had a very successful Mars orbiter, which is still there. It's
right.
India, yeah.
Right. So India is very ambitious. They want to get into the interplanetary game. They have the economic strength and the brain power and the infrastructure. They even have their own rockets, which are actually not pretty decent rockets. They have a good record, and they're building bigger ones all the time. I personally have been through some frustration with U.S. export controls and trying to get information about the Indian capabilities that in my past life, but because of there's a lot of complexities there I won't go into, but we have lots of players. We have, at a minimum, USA, Japan, ESA, Russia, China, and India. And probably others, going to pop up as time goes on. Brazil has been interested in space, although have not done much in interplanetary world. Brazil's a sleeping giant. When they find their footing, they're going to be strong to contend with. And so, yeah, there could be lots of countries. I agree that China is probably has the national will and the economic and technical footing to do a lot of things on the moon.
They're talking about putting astronauts on the moon within the next 5 to 10 years.
Which, I believe that's completely possible. I mean, after all, it was done in the 1960s with much cruder technology. You just need a big rocket.
Possible.
You need a big rocket, and they've been building bigger and bigger rockets as time goes on.
Yes, their current schedule is that they're looking. We've mentioned obviously the one going Chang'e 4 that would be going in 2018 to the far side. They also have the plan for Chang'e 5, which would be a sample return mission in 2017, and also Chang'e 6, which would be a second sample return mission. And the really exciting thing about those sample return missions is that instead of just blasting off from the surface of the moon and then returning the samples directly to the Earth, they're actually going to be doing orbital rendezvous in lunar orbit as a precursor for testing the technologies for future human missions. So they're really working towards that. But yeah, I'd probably estimate closer to 10 to 15 years or so. They're being very careful, slow, and considerate with their approach because they want it to be sustainable in the long term.
Right, and also they like most other national programs, it can't sustain a lot of failures, right? Failure tends to be politically difficult to deal with, even though, in my view, it's the way to learn, it's the way to grow, it's the way to get better. Failure politically can throw the spotlight on people who are doing good work and make them look like they're idiots. So, you have to go in small steps, and that's exactly what the U.S. did in the 60s. We did Gemini, then we did a few Apollo missions that did less ambitious things than land on the moon, and finally, after doing all the different steps, we did Apollo 11. Here's the there was a lot between there then and the first launches, and that was and there was still a lot of risk with that.
And
yet
you did it all in 10 years.
Yeah, well, there was a national will to do it at that point, I think. And there was a generation of engineers and scientists who were well poised to make it happen. And when President Kennedy said we choose to go to the moon, the whole country got behind him and said, yes, we're going to do this. Congress and the Senate, everybody. And there was a lot of excitement because nobody had ever done that before. Now, the question is, if you're doing something that somebody's done before, particularly if something that somebody did 60 years ago, you might have less excitement, but it depends on your society.
Well, nobody's built a moon village before.
That's true.
And don't you think that this long after it, we have a whole new generation who didn't get to experience the landings on the moon, and today we'd be able to do it in broadcast it in high definition TV rather than the crappy black and white.
Virtual reality. Forget about it. High definition TV, 3D virtual reality. You'll be able to put on a goggle and be there.
Yeah, well, it'd be a great show.
Well, I mean, just with what you said there about the generation that didn't get to experience it, of course, which I count myself amongst, because I was actually born about, what would it have been, 24 years after the landing, and I still find it incredibly inspirational. So the fact that you can have just a few events spread out over a period of 3 years that can have an inspirational effect that can last for 50 years or so, just imagine what we can do by having a permanently staffed outpost up there. Well, I just can't even imagine how long into the future the applications that will last.
Yeah, but we have to learn from the past failures, right? We had here in the U.S., and I will cop to this. We had a failure of will. It wasn't a failure of nerve. Wasn't a failure of ability. It was a failure of nerve, of will. We lost our will to continue, and we retreated to low Earth orbit. And that's a narrative that reasonable persons could disagree about. But my point is that this generation can learn from that, right? If we go to the moon, we can't make it a flags and footprints stunt. It's got to be a sustainable plan to continue based upon realistic funding profiles, based upon realistic capabilities. And you have to have, I think you have to bring in the commercial sector. You have to get them excited, and you have to give them a business plan, some way that they can make money off of it. It may be Malcolm Ridley making movies on the moon. I hope so. That would be fantastic. But
I think the Google Lunar X Prize could do a lot to inspire people and create a new interest in lunar exploration if it's a successful media event, which I hope it is.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the potential to see rovers racing on the moon within 3 or 4 years, perhaps. I mean, that is a stunt, basically, but it demonstrates new technologies, and it will be an exciting media event. And I hope that gets people interested.
Well, we shouldn't underestimate the value of entertainment and tourism on the moon, or anywhere in space. I think that tourism and entertainment will be up, just like porn was part of the development of the internet. In fact, probably paid for most of it. Let's face it, let's get real. That was billions of dollars poured into the internet by people wanting to look at other people naked. That was, there will be in space, there will be entertainment, there will be tourism. Who knows? There may even be porn, but
low gravity porn. Low gravity porn.
Yeah, zero gravity porn. I don't even want to think about that right now, but I don't want to think about that ever, actually. But that's because I'm old, and I don't get excited about things like that as easily as I used to. But we're dealing with humans here, right? If we want humans to move out into the cosmos, we have to give humans human reasons to do that. Not just science, not just mining or making money. There has to be, the excitement's going to come from lots of different directions at one time.
Well, so there's Space Adventures, for instance, which has organised many of the space tourism initiatives to date, and they have been looking for quite a few years to organise a circumlunar mission. And apparently they've already got one ticket sold for that for $150 million, and they're trying to sell the second ticket now.
Well, there's lots of Arabs out there who have $150 million, and a few people in Silicon Valley.
A lot of people paid $20 million to go to the International Space Station. Well, when I say a lot, several people have paid $20 million to go to the International Space Station. So
and if I had $20 million, I would do that too. Yeah. I mean, I don't think they do it anymore, but that was, that was actually a very exciting adventure, because even though it was a bit ad hoc and never officially endorsed, it had what it had about it was the emotional drive to go to space, right? People were there just because they desperately wanted to. They wanted so much they would spend the lifetime income of several middle-class people to get there. That's exciting. I mean, and if people are willing to spend $150 million, which is, I don't know what that's like, what, one share of Google? I'm not sure, but that's a lot of, that shows how emotionally involving and exciting it is for people to go to the moon. And that excitement, that feeling, that emotion is what's going to drive us to go there. It's not going to be, oh, we might discover something interesting about the origin of the moon, or we might build a radio telescope, although I personally would think that would be pretty cool. But it's going to be, I want to be there.
Yeah, I completely agree. It seems that's the real selling point of human spaceflight. It's the emotional connection that people have. I mean, we're going through human spaceflight fever in the UK at the moment because we've finally got our first official astronaut up there.
Oh, Tim Peake, yeah.
Yeah, so you can relate and place yourself in that situation. So it's exciting times for moving forward, of course, with the cost of access to space falling, and particularly as we can hopefully move forward into the era of reusable rocketry or space planes or whatever it might be. So yeah, that's what we want to do. We want to get down the cost of access to space so that more people can experience this wonderful effect.
Right. And that cost, I think that access cost will work its way down with patience and persistence. It's never going to be as cheap as buying a ticket to fly halfway across the continent, but it could get to where, yes, if this is something that is desperately important to you, you can afford it. And by you, I mean a middle-class person. It might be $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, but what do we spend on our houses? I live in the DC suburbs, where a typical house is about $500,000. That's U.S. dollars. And we find a way to raise that money. We all do. All ourselves and all our neighbors, we find a way to do it. And because it's important to us to have a home, right? If it's important to you to go to space, you will find a way. And it's particularly if there's a commercial return to space activities, then there becomes a way to pay for it. And that's something that I think that we have to get all those things connected together somehow. This passion, this emotion, this feeling that we have to be in space. That's our destiny. That's where our species is going. That's the purpose of our lives, is to go there. That's what our lives are about. And then, because our lives are no longer about just making babies and surviving, there has to be some other purpose.
So, are there commercially viable reasons for going to the moon? Is there stuff on the moon that can't be found on the Earth?
Oh, I can jump straight into that. So there's one of the most common examples that particularly the Chinese Space Agency have given for a resource they might be interested in extracting from the moon is helium-3. The reason why helium-3 is interesting is that you can undergo nuclear fusion reactions between helium-3 and deuterium, and it produces protons instead of neutrons as a byproduct. So you can trap the protons in an electromagnetic field, and hence it means that the outside wall of your reactor doesn't become irradiated. So it's potentially a much less radioactively damaging type of nuclear fusion power. So there's a lot of interest in the helium-3. I mean, I can see if I can find some of the interesting figures of how much you would need, say, here we are. So 20 tons of helium-3 per year, and you could power the United States, for instance.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of helium-3 for spaceflight for the same reason. Of course, we don't have a reactor that is viable for helium-3, but and we do believe there's helium-3 on the surface because it should be just trapped there from the solar wind. Ryan, do you know of any other evidence that there's helium-3 in quantity there?
So I'm just thinking, because it's complicated, because when, for instance, the Indians sent their first orbiter and the Chinese with Chang'e 3, they're being very careful not to officially say whether they're looking for helium-3 or not. Particularly with the Indian Space Agency's probes, someone leaked that their main goal was to look for helium-3, and then they quickly denied that. So there's been very little published thus far from actually in situ measurements of it.
Okay. Yeah, I believe, we don't really have a map of the density of helium-3 on the lunar surface, but there should be a fair bit of it. And as you pointed out, it makes it possible to build a reactor that has a very long life cycle. So if you want to take a deep space mission, then you would have a, you wouldn't have to worry about damage to your structure or your reactor for many, many years while you're powering this mission. So, in my view, the long term, if we can figure out how to build a reactor that's not, many, many tons, we could conquer the solar system with helium-3.
Yeah, I mean, if we're thinking in the very longer term, I mean, if you want to actually export material from the moon, what you would need, in principle, would be a lunar space elevator, which we can actually build with existing materials we have today. We could build it with Kevlar, for instance. So a lunar space elevator would be fantastic for exporting material from the moon, and then you can then use that material for whatever your needs might be. So I always envision that the future of the moon is very much as an industrial launching pad that can be used for material that we require elsewhere in the solar system and for our activities in space.
It would, of course, be much easier to launch from the moon than from the Earth.
Right. Well, the space elevator, you don't even launch, right? You just and also from the moon, as Ryan just pointed out, you don't need exotic materials to build an elevator. Whereas from the Earth, you would need materials that we don't have yet to build a space elevator, because the strength to weight ratio has to be very, very high for space elevator from the Earth. So that you could lift stuff off the moon with an elevator and get it into orbit, and you'd be you could easily move that material to wherever you need it.
Yeah, you also have the advantage that because the moon is rotating, you could effectively go right past the station you would have at the lunar stationary orbit to the top of the elevator, and just by letting go, you can effectively use the centrifugal acceleration from the moon to fire you out elsewhere in the solar system. So you effectively get a free delta V that you can use to get to certain destinations from it too.
Right. And so I think, there's a lot of missing pieces here, but in principle, we have the ability to use helium-3 to conquer the solar system. Now, helium-3 should also be available on asteroids, I want to point out. Perhaps, but the quantities you can get on the moon are going to be much, much greater. A typical asteroid, of course, just doesn't have as much area. It's not going to be able to provide as much helium-3. Now, we still need a helium-3 reactor. We haven't even built a deuterium reactor that is commercially viable yet. And that's, I guarantee you, that's only 50 years away.
It's always 50 years away.
Well, after I'm dead, it will be possible. No, but let's be, the honest thing is to say, we've been promised fusion for a long time. The physics is sound. The engineering is extremely difficult. And so we don't really know when it's going to be possible to build something like that. But once you have it, you can go all over the solar system at pretty much, and trip times are not going to be an issue at that point. Because you have so much energy density, you can just go wherever you want. If optimal trajectories be damned, we're going to go to Saturn or wherever we want to go.
Well, if we're looking to power the Earth, though, then one interesting possibility that I know the Chinese Space Agency is considering in the much longer term is to effectively manufacture solar panels on the moon using local resources, and then effectively beam the energy back to the Earth via microwave lasers, such that they can ensure energy independence. So I would love to see the greatest engineering marvel of this century being putting a thin band of solar panels around the equator of the moon, and you wouldn't even require, I mean, the angular size would be such that if you had enough solar panels to be able to power the entire planet, you would just be able to see it with the naked eye looking up at the moon. And I would love to be able to see that and know it's powering the world.
Yes, that would work in principle. I mean, it's a huge engineering project, but yeah.
There are mountains on the moon that are permanently illuminated by the sun. Some of the central uplifts in lunar craters are so high that they're permanently illuminated by the sun. You wouldn't even have to worry about the 2-week lunar night.
Well, if you had panels all the way around the equator, you would just, whichever ones were in the sun would be providing the power, right?
Yeah.
It's a big engineering project and a big mining project and a big manufacturing project, but Ryan's right. There's nothing in principle that's stopping us from doing that.
The other resource on the moon is water ice. We don't know how much of it is there, but it's a pretty sure bet that there's water ice in the very dark recesses of some of the craters on the moon. The only way to find out is to go there and look.
Yeah, I noticed we have a question from Patrick as well that has come in. So he's asked me if I feel that going to the moon to test new systems before we go to Mars is a good idea. And I would say I can certainly see advantages to testing certain systems, such as, say, if you're going to find the same local resources to first order on the moon as you are on Mars, particularly water, as Adam just mentioned. And so you could use the moon as a test bed in order to test in situ resource utilization technologies, certainly. The issue with that I would see is that if you develop systems specifically for the lunar environment, going through the day-night temperature extremes and no atmosphere, then it may turn out that by designing them specifically to work on the moon, you may have neglected something and they may not work on Mars. So overall, I would say there are some advantages to testing the principles, but the actual systems, I don't think you're really gaining an advantage from testing on the moon first.
I think the European Space Agency have been developing some very good new software for landing, things like slope detection, landmark recognition, safe site identification for landers. All that kind of thing is going to be useful. Well, the moon will provide an ideal test bed for that sort of technology going forward to landing on Mars.
What I would be interested to ask Ryan is whether, would it be better to establish a colony on the moon before we establish one on Mars? The advantages are that it's so close that you can, at least in principle, supply give them emergency supplies or do a rescue attempt and so on, which will be much more difficult on Mars. Wouldn't it make sense to tackle the moon first?
Well, I'd rather not have to choose between them, because it's even more exciting to go to both, of course.
Sure.
So in the longer term, it obviously makes sense to have humans living on Mars because it's much more hospitable to First Order. And it's a place where you can really imagine people living, whilst the Moon, as we've been mentioning, seems to be more of an industrial test bed. I mean, it's a difficult question because we stand to learn lessons on living in space, both from the Moon and from Mars. And the question is how much overlap there are going to be in those lessons. But I do completely agree. Obviously, it makes much more sense that you can get back from the Moon in a period of about 4 days or so if something were to get wrong. So I don't know overall. I mean, I don't think that we should consciously delay endeavors to develop technology to send humans to Mars just in anticipation of going to the Moon. Ideally, we should be working towards roughly the same time frame for both of them, and then share the lessons between the two projects.
Yeah, that seems to be what's happening, right? I mean, the U.S. is focused on Mars, and the rest of the world is thinking about the Moon. Although there's a lot of controversy about how to proceed with Mars, but I mean, maybe we could do both in parallel. I mean, it doesn't have to be an either-or situation.
No. I was a big fan of a mission concept that was pitched to NASA back in 2012 by a guy called Jack Burns, who's at the Lunar Science Institute at Boulder. Well, I think it's NASA Ames, isn't it? But he's also at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And he put forward a mission to send astronauts in the new Orion capsule to the lunar L2 Lagrange point, which is above the lunar far side. And from there, they would teleoperate rovers that had been sent in advance to the far side of the Moon. And the advantage of them being at the L2 point is that they would have a direct line of sight back to Earth for communications and also down to the Moon. Now, I thought that was a great idea and would be a great test of the Orion capsule. But NASA have decided to go with the asteroid redirect mission.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear, Adam, that one of the main conclusions from the European Symposium that was held last month was that teleoperation is something that almost all parties in the European Space Agency are keen to pursue for future lunar exploration. And actually, one of the things that Tim Peake is going to be doing is actually teleoperating a rover down at Stevenage in the UK. So, yeah, Europe's really be keen on pushing ahead with teleoperation.
Yeah, and teleoperation may, in fact, be our key to exploring Venus. And the Planetary Society is pushing teleoperation on Mars from Phobos. So there's a lot of there's a lot of people looking at that closely. So and that means your astronauts can be in like if you're at Earth Moon L1, you can be in the sun all the time. You don't have to worry about the moon's very difficult environment until you're ready to master that.
I have a question for Paul. How do you think that the American public would react if the Chinese did establish a lunar colony?
I think it would be largely, there'd be a combination of supportive and apathetic. I mean, there might be a little bit of envy, but I think that it wouldn't be very strong. It's not a big nationalist thing for us. That we were there in '69. Where were you? But especially if we're working towards getting a colony going on Phobos and Mars, then the only concern I would have would be if China made strong ownership claims to the Moon. If they made weak ownership claims, that is, they said, well, wherever we're landed, we own that territory within, say, 10 kilometers or whatever, and we can mine that without anyone interfering. That sort of thing going to have to be worked out. I think it'd be worked out peacefully and diplomatically and without a whole lot of anger and shouting.
You say that even considering the current Chinese attitude to the South, the South China Sea, where they're trying to block other people from getting in there.
Oh, well, we know that, we know there's a certain amount of militarism and aggression in the sort of an undercurrent in the Chinese government, but they also know that they're not going to succeed in the world economy unless they are at peace with the world economy.
Mm.
They have benefited enormously from the end of the Cold War, and they don't want to start it again. So, I have a phone, and so does my son, and so does my wife, and so does my daughter, that was made in China. That kind of exchange has been the source of their newfound prosperity, and it will go away if they start bullying the rest of the world. So that tendency that's kind of an undercurrent in their political environment cannot dominate their policy. If it does, bad things will happen everywhere. War is really bad. Do I have to say that again?
Don't forget that prior to World War One, all the experts were saying a war between Germany and the rest of Europe, or Germany and England, isn't feasible because there are too many trade associations between those nations. It would be completely crazy for them to go to war. But they still went to war.
Yeah, and it was completely crazy.
I'm sure it was. But
yes, it did happen, and I think the militarists won the fight there, particularly in Germany, with those people who want to go to war typically have extremely optimistic ideas of how much they can accomplish with military force. And the U.S. is no exception. I mean, the U.S. is probably the best example of that. What can we accomplish by going to Iraq with military force? Well, we can obliterate the Iraqi army, but that's only 10% of the problem, right? I
guess all I'm saying is that don't put it beyond the realms of possibility that the Chinese might build a colony on the moon and say, this is all ours. Who's going to stop them?
I agree that it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And there are so many issues tangled up in that. I'm not sure how to disentangle them. As you mentioned the South China Sea, you meant all the old rivalries in Asia that go back millennia. I don't know how to disentangle that from what's going to happen on the moon. I think it would be extremely expensive for anyone, including the U.S., to enforce any kind of claim on the moon with military force. It just the cost of that would be beyond what anyone could afford. But I agree with you. I wouldn't put it past them to give it a try. I wouldn't give it past the United States to give it a try.
So can I bring in another question from the audience?
Sure.
Yes, we've got a question from Nick Nielsen, and going back to the topic of space elevators. So he says that if we can't do an Earth elevator with current technology, but we can do a lunar one, then what about a Martian elevator into orbit? So from what I understand, current materials are not sufficiently strong to do a Martian elevator by about an order of magnitude in tensile strength. However, there's a fascinating paper that I read a few years ago that actually studies the concept of dangling a space elevator down from Phobos to about 100 kilometers above the Martian surface, and then using that in order to drop spacecraft to then glide down to Mars, and then having ones launching from Mars and then docking to the space elevator. So, I mean, I'll certainly send Paul a link for that to include in the show notes. But
Oh yeah,
we can't do the Martian elevator just yet.
I have not heard of that before. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that sounds like an interesting concept. Is it possible? Well, it would take probably a fair bit of study to figure it out, but it's a good concept.
It's possible. It's
so-
interesting in that it proposed. I mean, the paper goes through how you could use potentially local resources on Phobos to actually construct the elevator and gradually dangle it down. So yeah, it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic of that. We will have the materials technology within a few decades to do something like that. You have to figure out how to manufacture a lot of extremely strong nanomaterials that can have the weight to tensile strength that you need to hold that up. I mean, if you just do the simple math, it's pretty impressive how strong the materials have to be. Steel definitely doesn't work. Titanium doesn't work. Kevlar doesn't work for the Earth, but Kevlar might work for the Moon. So,
can I say something?
Sure.
One of the problems with a Martian space elevator is that it has to be above the orbit of Deimos, the smaller moon of Mars, and you essentially have to wobble the elevator to allow Deimos to pass by at each orbit.
Yes, that's why that the authors of this paper I mentioned saw the advantage of just dangling one down from Phobos to avoid that problem. You mentioned, Paul, about the simple mass behind it. So if anyone's interested, I've actually given a lecture before where I derive all of the mathematics behind how space elevators work. So I mean, I've got that recorded on YouTube, so I can send you a link to that as well.
Yeah, I'd like to see that very much. Yes, we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about helium-3. What else what would sustain a colony on the Moon? Let's say the colony on the Moon was cut off from any support from Earth. Are they just going to grow potatoes?
Well, that's an interesting question because obviously you can make your oxygen easy enough just by electrolysis on your water ice effectively, but I'm somewhat more concerned about where you would get the other trace gases you need for your atmosphere, such as nitrogen. It's much easier in the case of Mars, where you can literally just extract nitrogen or argon from the Martian atmosphere, but there is no atmosphere on the Moon to do that. So, yeah, I mean, there's one of the more concerns that I have about long-term settlement of the Moon as to how independent in the long term the settlement could actually be and how dependent on resupply it would be.
Would growing plants be a problem because you've got a 2-week day-night cycle, or 4-week day-night cycle?
Well, if you go in the South Pole, for instance, in the Southern Atkin Basin that we mentioned, you can go along crater rims that are permanently illuminated, so that can get around that problem.
But that confines you to a very small part of the Moon, right? I mean,
yeah,
in terms
true.
of, I mean, you could store energy during the lunar day and then use it to illuminate the plants at night. But I mean, we're all going to probably get pretty used to that idea over the next 20 years. I know that Elon Musk has his battery. He wants to put it in every home in America. That will allow us to put solar panels on our roofs and store the energy for night. Yeah, here in the U.S. and everywhere probably in temperate zone, nighttime is where it gets coolest in the winter. So you need to be able to store the energy, and we're probably gonna talk. Actually, I'm thinking maybe next week we'll talk about that in more detail. But yeah, it is possible to do that. It is possible to store enough energy during the lunar day where you have continuous sunlight for 14 days or so, and then use that energy during the 14 days that you don't have any sunlight to illuminate your plants or whatever. It's not a trivial engineering problem, but it certainly sounds solvable to me.
Yeah, and another of the resources that you really need to establish is, can you make, say, for instance, 3D printer feedstock using the lunar regolith? That's something that the European Space Agency is looking into quite a fair bit, because it's one of their long-term concepts for this lunar village. They want to make have machines that will effectively build out of the regolith large structures that basically it's to provide radiation protection as well as protection from the thermal temperature swings. So most people would then live in these almost like regolith type igloos. That's what they look like. So yeah, so you need to be able to increase your living volume without just having to ship them all prefabricated from the Earth.
Okay, I'm going to put in a plug here. Several months ago, Mike Mongo interviewed Jay Novosov about the caves of the moon. We still don't know very much about these lunar lava tubes or caves, but they could be, if we learn more about them, ideal habitats. And Jay has a plan to explore the caves of the moon without actually having to touch humans or robots down at the mouth of the cave. So I'll give you a link to that in the show notes as well. There are lava tubes where you could, in principle, park a colony on the moon and no radiation. It risks very little micrometeorite risk, and thermally pretty stable. It would lose a lot of heat during the lunar night. So yeah, that we need to know more, but that's a potential for lunar villages or colonies.
It's a possibility for Mars as well. There are, of course, lava tubes that have been evacuated for quite some time on Mars. The issue is just, where are they? How large are they? There's so many unknowns about them. But I completely agree that in the long term, if you can just find a pre-excavated cavern that you can just cap and then just fill it with an atmosphere, then I think that's an excellent idea.
Okay. Now, you guys know about our recommendations feature that we do, or trying to do every episode now, that each episode we ask our panelists to recommend one thing that they find particularly helpful or interesting or fun. It could be a book, a website, movie, music, something, whatever you want to recommend. I have something in mind right now, and but we'll start with Adam.
Something that I do with my family on a Sunday afternoon is I take part in a citizen science project called Snapshot Serengeti, which is part of the Zooniverse citizen science thing. It's snapshotserengeti.org, and it's helping to identify the animals that live in the Serengeti Plains in Africa. There are a number of motion sensor cameras dotted around the Serengeti, and they take pictures of lions, wildebeest, gazelles, monkeys, you name it, all the animals that live in the Serengeti. And it's something that you can do with your kids, and it's helping science. It's great fun. So take a look at snapshotserengeti.org. It's compelling viewing for all the family.
Great. Snapshot Serengeti. David, any recommendations?
Well, with me, it's usually a book. I read a lot of books. In fact, this is a book I reread recently, which is Richard Greenberg's book, Unmasking Europa, which is fairly controversial in the sense that he and his team were very much at odds with the rest of the Europa imaging team, analysis team, about whether Europa has a relatively thin crust of ice or whether it in effect has a very thick crust of ice. And Greenberg's team really were very much of the view that the ice crust over the ocean on Europa is relatively thin. It may be still 1 or 2 kilometers, but still. that there is a liquid ocean beneath the crust, which is in constant communication with the surface, in that the surface breaks up. There are upwellings of heat that melt the surface. The cracks open and close at regular intervals, and so on. And he has a lot of evidence for it. It's a very convincing book, but it's very much against the received wisdom, as it were, of the Europa team, based on the Galileo probe. So I reread it recently, and it still holds up very well. I don't think much has changed to dispute his conclusions, unless there's something I haven't read. But I thought it was a very interesting book, very well written book too.
Okay, what is that again? It's called Europa.
Unmasking Europa.
Unmasking Europa.
Yeah,
Okay.
by Richard Greenberg, and he was
Greenberg.
yeah. It's a very interesting book.
Okay, great. Ryan.
Well, firstly, I just wanted to reiterate Adam's recommendation for the Zooniverse. I spent some time working with the Zooniverse collaboration when I was doing my undergrad in Oxford to help build the Higgs Hunters experiment that they've got up there, their first particle physics project. But my recommendation is for people looking to learn more about space exploration and build up from a kind of the popular level of knowledge that you have, and to actually understanding some of the mathematical basics and about aerospace engineering, is that there's a number of fantastic online courses that are free for anyone to try on edX.org. That's just edx.org. So they've got ones on the history of spaceflight, space mission design, on basic rocketry, for instance. And I just think that's a fantastic way that you can actually start to bridge the technical divide between being interested in space and being able to actively participate in the frontier.
Can I just agree with that and say that I think it's through Coursera. There's a Caltech course run by Mike Brown. He's the Pluto killer, called Science of the Solar System, and that's a fantastic course. I've
taken it too. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, I'm also a big fan of Zooniverse. I've done a fair bit of Galaxy Zoo myself, and I enjoyed that very much. And there's a lot of other projects attached to Galaxy Zoo. My recommendation is going to be a book by a guy I've actually briefly worked with. His name is Dennis Wingo, and he's written a book called Moonrush, which is a book about what is of value on the moon and why we should go there for business reasons. It's not a book about the science of the moon so much, although there is science in it, but Dennis has done a fair bit of work on why the moon could be a profitable venture. And that's, as we've discussed before, in my opinion, incredibly important to going to the moon and staying on the moon. So that's Moonrush by Dennis Wingo. And actually, I hope to have Dennis on the Wow Signal podcast in the near future to talk about that book and his ideas about why we should be on the moon. There's science to be done on the moon, but as Freeman Dyson pointed out, the science per dollar we got out of Apollo was pretty low compared to other missions where we got a high science per dollar. So that's something that we have to consider when we excuse me, I'm messing around with my software here. When we think about why we go back to the moon. Okay, here's my little rant. I think we should go back to the moon. I think we should go back to the moon to stay. I think we should go back to the moon to make money. I think we should go back to the moon to do incredibly important science. But it shouldn't be just the moon or Mars or the moon or something else. It should be the moon and whatever else we're doing. So, now I'm going to let my panelists have less word, then I'll have my final begging and pleading and nagging segment. So, Adam, any last words about the moon?
I'm reminded of an ancient Chinese curse, which translates into English as, "May you live in interesting times." I think the moon is a harsh mistress. We do live in interesting times, and when the Chinese do establish a moon base, which they will, things will get interesting on the moon. I can see something of a moon rush happening over the next 20 years. Let's hope I'm right.
I hope you're right too. Okay, David.
Well, I'm in agreement. I think we should go back to the moon. I think we must go back to the moon. But it certainly has to be sustainable, and there has to be a real reason for it other than simply national pride. But I think there are other reasons to do that, and I think we will discover them. I'm very optimistic about the commercial development of space, and I think that's the thing that will drive our exploration of the solar system. Money always talks, unfortunately, but that's the way it seems to be. But I think there are commercial possibilities out there, and I think there are a lot of clever people looking to see what they are. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the future. I hope I'm around long enough to see all of it, a lot of it anyway.
And our new panelist, Ryan MacDonald, what do you think?
Well, I mean, if we just look at the inspirational benefits that we got from Apollo, which we can integrate over the past 50 years and still feel them today, that's barely scratching the surface of what the moon has to offer us. And that's why we need to go back there, we need to stay there, we need to do industry, science, and ultimately what I'm most excited by is how we can tap into the overview effect, it's called. When we have a lasting lunar settlement on the surface that can look back at the Earth, or maybe look back with a mirror at L2 if they're on the far side, and be able to see the Earth where we came from and see that as the first tangible stepping stone out there into the solar system and eventually further afield. I can't wait to see how that causes us to reflect culturally as a species on our future out there in the universe. So exciting times are certainly ahead.
Okay, I'd like to thank all our panelists, Adam, David, and Ryan. I think this has been a really excellent discussion. Everyone's better than I am, which is not always the case. But thank you very much. I just want to add a couple of little notes here. First of all, I'd like to encourage you to consider a completely separate topic, something I've been obsessed with for the last 36 hours or so, which has been the subject of Tabby's star. I interviewed Bradley Schaefer about that last night. I'd like, if you want to go to wowsignalpodcast.com, that interview is there. It's really interesting, and what he's discovered, if it's confirmed, and I think it likely will be, is extremely interesting, an anomaly in the brightness of what seems to be otherwise a very ordinary star. And Tabitha Boyage and her team have found other anomalies at much shorter timescales. So we don't know what that's about. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it certainly is an interesting puzzle. If you have any ideas, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You can go to unseenpodcast.com and comment directly on the blog post for this episode, which will be, at least in the next few days, the top episode on unseenpodcast.com. This will be episode 39 if you can't find it anywhere else. Or you could email unseenpodcast@gmail.com. We love to get comments from listeners. You can also go to our Google Plus listeners forum or our Reddit or subreddit for listeners. All those links are on unseenpodcast.com. This is an open participation podcast. If you would like to be on the panel, all you need to do is email unseenpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll tell you the simple steps for getting on the panel, just like Adam, David, and Ryan. Now, I would like to point out that for Adam and Ryan, it is extremely early in the morning in the United Kingdom, and I appreciate them being up this late. David's a little bit more of on a normal Saturday schedule. Hopefully the grandkids aren't too much of a problem today.
Not today.
But I appreciate having an international panel. I really want to get to that as much as possible, and not just a bunch of Americans. So thank you guys for staying up late and coming on the show. And I would also like to encourage you very briefly to go to patreon.com/Unseen Podcast if you'd like to support the show. But the best way to support the show is to share the episodes that you like with your friends and followers. So retweet us or share us on Google Plus or Facebook. Thank you for Mateusz Macias for putting our Facebook page together. And also I'd like to thank you very much to DJ Spooky, who does the Creative Commons music that we've been using on this podcast. So thanks everybody. Again, unseenpodcast.com, and we will see you next week. I think we're going to be talking about energy next week. Hopefully we'll have another international panel next week. So stay tuned, and we'll see you on episode 40 next week. Thanks and good night.
Bye.